I am pleased this morning to introduce Professor Juie Mares, who is a professor in the Department of Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences in the medical school here. Julie is a widely affiliated member of the faculty. She's a trainer in the interdepartmental training program in nutritional sciences. She's a trainer in an interdepartmental program in public health. She's associated with the Institute on Aging. She's part of a national study on diet and vision. That's part of the Women's Health Initiative. It is commonly thought that we are what we eat, and she works on what we eat. And it turns out that we are not just protein, carbohydrate, and water. There are other things, and I left out something, fats. We're more than that. The University of Wisconsin has a long tradition, and Julie is part of it, in working on other things in the diet, and vitamins and food and small molecules contained in food that affect our health and the way body chemistry works. And she's here to talk to us about how things we eat affect our vision and our ability to maintain healthy eyes as we get older. It is a pleasure to be able to introduce to you Juie Mares, professor of ophthalmology at the University of Wisconsin. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Millard. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for all of you coming. I'm delighted to share what I've learned in the past 40 years of working in the area of diet and health with you, which is a whole lot more than we knew 40 years ago when I started out, and a couple of ophthalmologists at the University of Wisconsin asked me to join them. I had not had any experience in eye health except as a nutritional scientist. I knew gross deficiencies, normally in impoverished countries around the world, did have consequences in the eye. And the two ophthalmologists, Ron and Barbara Klein, invited me to their community study in Beaver Dam, which was the first community study of risk factors, prevalence and risk factors for common age-related eye diseases that we'll talk about today. And this has gone through many eras of different thinking about nutrition and health. You may remember the era in the 1980s and 90s when high-dose antioxidants were popular for every chronic disease, and people were taking beta-carotene supplements, and now we've moved into another era where we're looking at overall healthy diet patterns. So I hope to talk about food in relation to health, both the nutrients that might help our eyes and how to put that into practice on a day-to-day basis, because really the evidence now is more strong when we look at overall healthy diets. And now, different than 40 years ago, we know that good nutrition is suspected of lowering risk for all common causes of visual impairment. This includes a retinopathy in the back of the eye that is more common in people with diabetes. It includes cataract, which all of us have some sort of opacity. The density of our lens and the opacity of our lens changes from age 20 as long as we have our lens. Now, this is the most common eye disease in the world that limits vision. But we don't see that here anymore because it's so common to be able to go get a replacement of our lens, a new intraocular lens, by a simple outpatient surgery. So I won't be covering those in general, but whatever I'm talking about, more specifically about the next two retinal diseases, glaucoma and macular degeneration, really applies to those conditions as well. There is no major difference between what we would recommend to improve eye health across those different types of eye conditions. On this cross-section of the slide, you can see the area where macular degeneration develops. So I'm going to most focus on macular degeneration because we have the most evidence about this condition. So this is an eye with the retina back here. A retina can be likened to the film in a camera. It takes an image and sends it back to the brain through the optic nerve so we can see. And macular degeneration can develop right there. You notice that that is directly in line from the light that comes into the eye. It's focused by the lens right at that point. So that is the area of the eye that receives the most light exposure, which is a good thing because it helps us to see fine detail. There are many cones there. Perhaps you've heard of rods and cones, and so the cone photoreceptors are especially dense right in that center of the fovea. And there are rods more on the periphery that can be involved in this disease as well, but the biggest change is in the center. We'll be talking a little bit too about glaucoma, another common cause of vision impairment. And when we talk about it, I just wanted to point out that the damage in glaucoma happens a little to the side of the damage that happens with macular degeneration. And you'll see how that affects somebody's ability to see. But some of the pathology that causes glaucoma starts in the front of the eye. And it could be hard for fluid in the front of the eye to move to the back of the eye. When it gets clogged up, it can increase eye pressure. And that is a common risk factor for having glaucoma. So I wanted to point out two more things. One is that about halfway into our discussion today, I'll be talking about a specific carotenoid plant pigment. And this here is not a natural part of the eye, but I put that little dot there to show you where this plant pigment accumulates, which we think is a sunglass that nature has provided. I also point out that there's a little bit of that in the lens, but also, as we get older, our lenses not only get more dense, but they turn a little yellower. And that provides some protection against the damage to the back of the eye or the retina. But if we have our lens replaced by an intraocular lens, we may have to provide our eye a little more protection. Okay, let's look in a little more detail at age-related macular degeneration. This is the back of the eye, the retina, and you can see these yellow, whitish blobs there on the back of the eye. They look and they are really composed very similar to atherosclerotic plaques. That is, they're rich in lipids and in calcium, just like plaques are. And that is the beginning of the process of macular degeneration. Many of us never progress past that point. Most of us have some early changing happening like that we consider just part of normal aging. So it's common. A quarter of us over 65 years have significant drusen. And if they're of a certain size, we'll be talking about a supplement that people recommend to slow the progression from early stages to late stages. Now, advanced macular degeneration develops slowly, usually, and it results in actual loss of cones and loss of rods. So whereas in the beginning of macular degeneration, we could either have normal vision or slightly blurred vision, as it gets to the advanced stage, the loss of rods and cones can mean that we don't see anything in the center of our field of vision, like people's faces. I should also point out that while there are no major changes to vision in the early stages, often people that are on this process first report having a hard time adjusting to low light when they come in from the outside. That is, we have a slowed ability to adapt to darker situations or have our rods take over. Rods are responsible for vision under low light. So some of the early signs are an inability to be able to adjust quickly to changing from highly lit to lowly lit areas. And it causes some difficulty, but just often with aging, I don't know if you find, I find that you just have to get used to a new way of living. So I take a little more time in adjusting to the dim situation. So this is one situation that may not be catastrophic, but we definitely want to prevent the later stages. And like macular degeneration, as I mentioned, glaucoma is a retinal disease that happens to the side of our field of vision. So you can see when we have severe stages of glaucoma, it's not the center that's lost, like in macular degeneration, but it's a slow progression of loss of vision from the side in towards the center. It's more common with age, as with macular degeneration. As with macular degeneration, family history can play a role. We're starting to learn some of the genes and the gene variants that are involved. And as I mentioned earlier, having high eye pressure can increase risk for developing glaucoma. And as with macular degeneration, diet and lifestyle there's a strong body of evidence that diet and lifestyle slows progression. With glaucoma, the body of evidence is not quite as strong, but it's moving in the same direction. I see no reason that all of the 4 eye diseases that I mentioned at the beginning won't all benefit from healthy diets and lifestyles. So which aspects of diet? What should we change? What should we focus on? Well, you're probably like me, where you see something you get a sound bite on the news or on the radio or a newspaper, and now even the internet, and they say, take this, eat eggs, don't eat eggs, eat eggs. So you might see studies that say eating eggs are good for our eyes now. We'll talk about that. Eating greens or eating oranges. These are all true, actually, but some of these are just based on one study. And the kind of evidence I'm talking about, and that is important to really guide our thinking, is a large body of evidence, many studies, and different types. This shows you a picture which illustrates that large body of evidence that we come to depend on. If we only see, as scientists, we see one study, we say, oh, kind of interesting, maybe we should look into that. And it gets reported quite easily. Even when you tell a reporter, ooh, no, that's preliminary data, I don't want to share it. I found once that was in the Chicago Tribune. So stuff leaks really quickly into the media, intentionally and unintentionally, and we need to look deeper. So a strong body of evidence often starts with experiments in patients, in animals, in cells. There's a lot of experimentation in retinal cells, for example. And these are important because they prove mechanisms that are involved. Exactly what does beta carotene do? Exactly what does vitamin A do, for example? Then, the kind of study I conduct usually are observational studies in large populations, like the Beaver Dam Eye Study, but more recently I'll show you a study on carotenoids that we've been working on. And there are studies now all over the world. Actually, the Ron and Barbara Klein started eye studies in communities all over the world. They told them how to measure how to look at, how to take the photos, how to evaluate them in a standardized way. And so now we have populations in Australia, in France, in the Netherlands, all over the world, and we're all asking, are we getting the same results? Now, you might have heard that randomized clinical trials are the gold standard. And often that is true for medical doctors when they're trying to recommend a drug. And I will also talk about clinical trials of specific supplements that have been done and have informed this area of research. But what is especially interesting to me are randomized trials of diets that have been conducted in the last 10 years that really give us a cohesive body of evidence. They tell us that adhering to the diet compared to not, and very specific aspects of the diet are associated with slower progression of these things that can interfere with our vision. And so, in a nutshell, what we're going to talk about is, it has convinced me that nutrition matters, not just for terrible nutrient deficiencies, diseases. The trials have proven that nutritional interventions lower the risk for chronic diseases that are promoted by the processes that promote eye health. So, for example, hypertension, one of the diet patterns we're going to talk about, has proven to lower blood pressure. And the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine came to our university and said, it is the frontline treatment for managing hypertension, not medications. So other types of processes that are outcomes in trials include blood sugar increasing, measurement of oxidative stress and inflammation. We'll talk about these two types of things as well. And we'll talk also about these clinical trials, age-related eye disease study 1 and 2, that were conducted throughout the United States, that are supplements that and studied in relation to the progression of macular degeneration as well as cataract. And the early trials do suggest, including some of the smaller trials, that taking certain supplements can improve vision. And the benefit of also having the population studies, it's not only in people who signed up for clinical trials. Often that isn't the same kind of person as you and I. And so when you look at a whole body evidence, you like to see the same results in both trials, in either small populations in the clinical trials or populations that are very diseased or very different in some way than us. You like to see all that line up. So I'm going to show you that population studies suggest that healthy diets lower our chances of getting early AMD and work synergistically with physical activity and not smoking to lower risk. What type of diets? Well, I first want to talk about a group of food components called antioxidants, because there's a lot of evidence that there is a lot of oxidant stress, which antioxidants protect against in the retina, so related to the development of macular degeneration as well as glaucoma. As we talked about, there are stressors directly to the eye, especially light, but also the retina does a lot of work to get the right nutrients into the retina, into the inner sections of the retina, and to clear waste products. It's very active. The tips of our rods renew every couple of days. And so there's a lot of business that happens, and it needs oxygen. And oxygen gets unstable as a result of exposure to light, and as a result of exposure going through the cycle, biochemical cycle, to create energy as ATP. What's wrong with that? There's damage then to lipids, proteins, and DNA. So we'd like to avoid that. And the eye is also especially vulnerable to damage to lipids. In our eye is the kind of oil that fish oil is comprised of, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. And that's important to keep them fluid and to do the jobs that they need to do. But also, they're more easily oxidized. So what I like about the AIRDS trials, and that the trial was of this specific supplement, is that this supplement containing these antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, lutein, and zinc, slowed, just over 5 years, slowed the development of AMD. In other words, the milieu in our eye can really be impacted by antioxidants. They did another study which tweaked that to say, let's add the carotenoid that actually gets into the retina instead of the carotenoid that doesn't. And they found there was a bit of improvement with that as well, especially in people whose diets were low in that. So that's a handful of nutrients, I mean to say. So can you imagine what all the antioxidant compounds that are present in fruits and vegetables, the impact that might have on a day-to-day basis over many years? There are many antioxidant compounds in foods, such as flavonoids. So, you know, the hundreds of antioxidant compounds, which we know can lower oxidative stress, are widely distributed in fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Many of those compounds block inflammation, have anti-inflammatory properties. And inflammation can cause this oxidative stress. That's how it kills invading cells. So not only do supplements provide antioxidants to protect against antioxidant damage, so do fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. But it's not just the nutrients. What we're learning now is really very exciting, because one of the leftovers, fiber, is what healthy microbes eat. And I am just awed by this paradigm-changing research. And it suggests so far that microbes eat dietary fibers, some types more than others. We're still sorting that out, though, exactly. We can't just put the kind of fiber in a bottle and assume it's going to be sufficient. So fruits and vegetables are better. And then we can prevent unhealthy microbes population, which is permissive for the development of metabolic syndrome, central adiposity, low blood sugar, high triglycerides, and hypertension. And many of these are risk factors for age-related eye diseases. And this situation can cause inflammation and oxidative stress. So I wanted to show you the whole picture and why I really focus on the whole diet. Okay, I'm going to show you that study that we're conducting. It's the carotenoids and age-related eye disease study in women who are originally 53 to 86 years of old at the time of CAREDS. 6 years earlier, they participated in the nationwide Women's Health Initiative. Is anybody here in the Women's Health Initiative? Yes, I have a couple. Thank you, thank you. And is anybody here in this Diet and Vision study? Well, anyway, the people that participate in these trials often just give so much time, and they've taught us so much, so I really appreciate it. So there are 40 nationwide sites to the WHI. My collaborator, Barb Blody, picked the sites that had the most advanced skills in measuring eye photographs, taking them and making measurements from them. And that was about 2,000 people. When they came into WHI, they provided boatloads of information about their diet, their life history, their medical history, and it is updated every year. And they continue to be followed. You probably know all the questionnaires that come your way. So some women are still in the study. I'm going to show you data from that was collected in the early 2000s, where we looked at density of that pigment that I said protects the eye, lots of information about diet and supplements. We used blood that was collected at baseline to know nutrients in blood, together with photographs of the eye and vision function tests. So the next data I'll show you will be from this. And then at the end, I'll give you a sneak preview of what we're learning in the follow-up study 15 years later. The data just came in. And so we'll be publishing a lot of that over the next year or two. So we found that women who had healthy diets had lower presence of age-related macular degeneration. This slide shows the percent with early or worse macular degeneration. And what do we mean by healthy diets on this slide? We're talking here adhered to the US dietary guidelines. So there's a score that predicts that, and those that were in the highest 20% had a twofold lower likelihood of having early age-related macular degeneration 6 years later. People who adhered to a Mediterranean diet score, which we'll talk more about, had an even lower odds of having this condition. We also learned that a combination of healthy lifestyles lowered this estimated risk for macular degeneration threefold in the same population. So we're talking about women who had reported moderate exercise. Now you might say 8 to 10 hours a week. That's not moderate, but we're including housework, yard work, walks, just moving, just moving. I mean, I'm sure many of them also did something more strenuous, but this was our criteria for the score. And they had the healthiest diet scores according to the US diet recommendation in the highest 20%, and they had never smoked more than 7 pack years in their life. Compared with women who had no regular exercise, healthy diet scores in the lowest 20, and smoked more than 8 years. But you can see here that there is a progression. I see this pattern in data sets all over that I look at in other samples too, which suggests to me that we, by starting to adopt some of these, if we haven't done so already, might result in improvements. Even just to begin to adopt some more of these patterns could have, over years, a beneficial effect. We don't need to necessarily adhere to everything 100% to see those associations. This is interesting to me. We found that healthy diets and lifestyles were associated with a twofold lowering in the odds of having macular degeneration that are associated with a specific gene variant. The gene variant is complement factor H, or CFH. There are not many chronic diseases that are predicted by single genes, but macular degeneration is an exception. So those of us that have 2 risk variants for complement factor H have, or at least in this study, had a 4-fold higher odds of having macular degeneration if they had low scores on the healthy diet pattern relative to high. So Some of my colleagues interpret this as we can eat away our genetic risk. So let's talk about what a healthy diet is now. Michael Pollan, I think, really summarized it great about 10 years ago, don't you think? Eat food, real food that your grandmother would have made, mostly plants, not too much. And I still think that's really great advice. But I think nutritionists would probably add that varied food is good. You're more assured to get all of the individual nutrients that we need if we vary it, not eat the same thing every day. And you can see in this picture, this is a varied diet and very colorful, meaning there are many different of those bioactive plant compounds that can be protective on many levels in your daily diet. Actually, this is what I just had for breakfast. Eggs on greens with avocado. And we'll talk about why that's relevant as we move on. There are several healthy diet patterns. Which one? We're going to talk about 3 of them. And I have also provided you with sheets that give the details of these. So you don't need to worry specifically about the details, and we can talk about some of these. The first one is the Mediterranean diet pattern. It's modeled after the diet pattern on Crete. And I'm sorry, I see that the PowerPoint somehow here doesn't show the axes, so I'll tell you what it is. So this is the percent of fat, the percent of energy as saturated fat along this line. Low, high. Here's the US. And this axis is the percent who died from heart disease. This was in the 1950s. I don't know if you remember Ansel Keys in the 7-country study. There was an epidemic of heart disease in men in the US. And there was this thought, well, maybe it's lipids. So he went to 7 different villages across the world, including in the US, and he found indeed people who consume more of their diets as saturated fat had higher rates of death due to heart disease. But there was this community here, an island, the Greek island of Crete. They didn't have the lowest saturated fat intake, but they had the lowest mortality overall. And so many of us have been saying, what are those guys eating? And many people have come up with different versions of what they're eating and what to include in a diet and to score it so we can compare what we're eating with what they ate. And so we'll talk about that. And I'll talk about how these other 2 diet patterns are so similar to the Mediterranean diet pattern, but important in some different ways. Oh, that's a little better. I see. Okay, so you can see there, that's where we were in the 1950s relative to Crete. Ah, that's why. Okay. So here I want to focus on the similarities. All of them are plant-rich diets with abundant fruits and vegetables, most of them whole fruits and vegetables, and that's important to get the fiber, and also important so that your blood sugar doesn't increase too much. And they recommend between 5 and 9 per day, 1 to 2 per meal, depending on the pattern. They differ a little bit across patterns. They contain grains. So for eating grains, not refined grains, not processed grains, you get points for whole grains. And a variety of protein sources, including plants, which come along with a lot of the plant bioactive chemicals that lower inflammation and oxidative stress, but also good fibers, good fats, as well as They all contain a recommendation for eating white meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. They differ the most in dairy, and we can talk about that. And all of them suggest that if we eat red and processed meat, we limit it to no more than 2 times a week, or get the most points for that. The other diet patterns I'm going to briefly explain. The dietary approach to stopping hypertension is that trial that I told you about that was found to lower blood pressure and is now the frontline treatment for high blood pressure. And then the US dietary guidelines have changed. So right now, they're almost identical to the DASH and the Mediterranean diet patterns, because so much data has accumulated to indicate chronic disease is lower with those 2 diet patterns. So I went to the island of Crete. I was beginning to start scoring diet patterns. And I had wanted to go there for a long time anyway, because I had a grandpa that came over from Greece, and I had no idea what it was like. And so I observed the more traditional Greek patterns that are on Crete, this isolated island, which in the mountains adhere still to many of the traditional patterns. And what I learned, and they advertised widely about the Mediterranean lifestyle, they were saying, hey, it's not just diet. Their publications, like, oh, okay. They walked an average of 10 kilometers a day, those men on Crete. So they were getting a lot of physical activity. Now, nobody gets physical activity there at noon. The streets are empty, even in places like Athens or the busier areas, they're empty. And myself and my kids were wandering the streets, and it's terribly hot, not wanting to miss a moment, but it's just like everybody goes to sleep or is sleeping after their lunch. They're smart enough not to expose themselves to the direct, intense sun, but they're very active in the morning. So this is an actual path that I walked down, and you'd see people picking a piece of fruit off the trees. They have a sense of joy there that I think might be part of the whole thing, too. One guy said, Kali Mara, good morning. So it was a good scene. So if we get light, we now know that it sets our biorhythms. And that is really important in getting a healthy night's sleep. If we get a healthy night's sleep, I'm sure we've all experienced how we eat better. If we haven't eaten well, we choose sometimes things that give us a quick, good feeling. We tend not to exercise. So getting healthy night's sleep is good. And our cells in our eyes do give our brain the signal about our biorhythms to set them. When we're outside, that gives us a chance to make vitamin D if some of our skin is exposed. So again, it's good. Of course, we don't want to be out in really bright sunlight for very long periods of time, but 30 minutes can often be enough. We'll talk more about vitamin D. That's a tricky one. But I really agree with this sign that I saw at Indian Lake Park, a comment that Aldo Leopold made. A walk in nature never fails to deliver more than I expect. Do you find that too? It's like, oh, I don't want to go out, but oh my God, I'm so glad I did. You find yourself looking at the birds and all the sounds outside. And this is also a restaurant on a mountaintop on that island of Crete that I went to. And I saw many large families together eating for a long time, usually with wine. And indeed, in the Mediterranean diet pattern gives you points for an appropriate moderate amount of wine intake. And we all know that food gives us sensory pleasure. Sometimes can be an adventure. When we eat our foods, we maybe sometimes feel connected to people that we have that same food. Like, do you find that? You have certain family foods that really give you that toasty feeling. This last weekend had for my dad's 95th birthday, our family favorite, which was roast pork, dumplings made with refined flour, gravy, and sauerkraut with lots of caraway. And whether I am sitting with him or without him, I think about him. So even when we're sitting alone, it can just bring back that feeling. And I wonder if some of this, the endorphins, the vigor for life we get, doesn't come from some of these other things that we can't easily measure. So in the question and answer session, I'd love to hear some of those other things of food that you find valuable. Okay, now we're going to talk about some differences in the Mediterranean diet patterns that are relevant for macular degeneration and also brain health. The relationships between diet and Alzheimer's disease and cognitive function are going in the same direction. So the Mediterranean diet, more than other patterns, emphasizes a higher intake of omega-3 fatty acids. Remember, those are the fatty acids that are in the membranes of the cells, in nerve cells in the eye and in the brain. The omega-3 fatty acids in fish are long chain, and those are the kind that our eyes need. But we can also make the long chain fatty acids if we eat the short chain version that we can find in things like nuts and olive oil. The sticker is, though, that we all differ in our ability to convert the short chain to the long chain. So I think it's probably good to get some fish, some long chain, just in case our genetic makeup is such that we can't make the long chain. But fish provides so much more. Fish provides vitamin D, which people were finding more and more commonly have poor status of. And it's important for bone health, but also for retinal neurodegeneration. Also, B vitamins. There is some recent evidence that certain B vitamins slow the rate of progression to AMD. It hasn't been widely studied, but this might be, just looking at what might be providing that benefit from fish. It could be these other things. It could be minerals like selenium and zinc, which are also important in the eye. So many population studies have found that people who eat 2 or more servings a week have less macular degeneration. But then that ARIDS trial with those high-dose antioxidant supplements tried adding omega-3 fatty acids and saw no effect. So now we're scratching our heads and saying, maybe it's other things. Maybe it's not just the omega-3 fatty acids. Greens. Wow, there was an abundance of greens. And this was something, too, that they highlighted in their literature, how many wild greens there were on Crete. And this was from that same lunch where I saw the large family eating together. And I asked for a plate of legumes, which you see here, and greens. I expected to see like a little side of greens, but this must be 2 cups. So they love their greens. They eat them at many meals, not just directly like this. Often it's by adding many herbs, which are just all over their countryside. Also, they have many herbal tea infusions that they drink throughout the day. So they eat a lot of greens, and we don't really score on any diet patterns, the intake of greens. So that might if we added greens, we might find that that is an important component that we haven't taken into consideration. And this is important for the brain as well, because as we will talk about, some of what the greens provide also accumulate in the brain. And the MIND diet, I don't know if you've heard of the MIND diet, it is essentially a Mediterranean diet, does recommend specifically higher intake of greens. So this is what I've been focusing the last 2 decades of my life on. This little pigment here that you can see now outdoors because it's right here in these large maples that we see because the green chlorophyll has receded. In the plants, it protects them from overexposure to the sun, and it also helps direct the sun energy to photosynthesis. And you can also see that yellow pigment. If you boil kale or spinach, you see that your water is yellow, and that is what accumulates in our eye. Not as large of a patch there, and actually it looks more like this. This is that lutein. Because it accumulates especially in the macula of the eye, we call it macular pigment. And a colleague of mine had made these images in rhesus monkeys who had died, and you can see that yellow that accumulates especially right here in that dip, that is the macula, the fovea, the center where most of the cones are. And you can see it's in a good position to protect the rest of the retina from sun exposure. And he shows the image too under a blue light. So not only you can see that it absorbs blue light, but you can see more specifically where the macular pigment is. So blue light is the most abundant wavelength of visible light in the environment, and this absorbs blue light. So what is this lutein? This is not a household term 20 years ago, maybe not yet even. It's an abundant carotenoid in our blood, like beta-carotene, but which we're more likely to have heard of beta-carotene. We're more likely to have heard that carrots are good for our eyes. Have you heard that? By the way, I learned that idea got started in World War II when people were encouraged to grow victory gardens. And there was no actual research. But maybe, I think sometimes our folk tales that we pass along end up being true because it's knowledge that develops over many years of observation, just anecdotal observation. But beta-carotene does not get into the nerve cells. So it does provide vitamin A, and that's important for night vision. But it doesn't get directly into the nerve cells. So in the diet and the blood, lutein and its isomers that are the same chemical formula, but just different shapes, comprise 25 to 40% of the carotenoids in diet and blood. We thought that beta-carotene was more important because it was the predominant carotenoid in the blood, and that's why there were so many trials of beta-carotene in cancer, beta-carotene in heart disease. Okay, but with regard to the eye and the brain, it's more important to consume correct amounts of lutein than the other carotenoids. So you can see in the eye, it is 80% the total carotenoids, and in the neural retina, the nerve cells, it's 100%. You can kind of tell often the kind of carotenoids a fruit and vegetable contains by the color, but many fruits and vegetables have all of them. Carrots have a lot of beta-carotene. Tomatoes have a lot of lycopene that we won't talk about, but it hasn't been studied too much with regard to the eye, or it hasn't ever come out as an important variable, but it is for other parts of the body. But as we've talked about, lutein and its isomers are high in spinach and green vegetables. Zeaxanthin is especially high in corn. And lutein and zeaxanthin are in egg yolks, but at much lower levels. But we think it might be more bioavailable. The increase in blood lutein is much quicker when we eat an egg than we eat spinach. So this is that supplement that is recommended by the American Academy of Ophthalmology if somebody has intermediate stages of macular degeneration or worse to slow progression. It has been shown to slow progression. It has been shown to be safe in that that study population for up to 10 years. So even though the trial was 5 years, it has been shown to be safe for 10 years. So lutein and zeaxanthin is now a component, as well as the other antioxidants, as well as zinc, which has some function as a component of antioxidant enzymes, and we think is doing some things independently. So in the first AREDS trial, just zinc supplements slowed the rate of progression as well a little bit. So we're still trying to understand exactly why that is. So here is what we used in the first study. Max came and took me out to lunch in 1998, and he said, hey, I think lutein's important, and we can measure it. And I was working in the Beaver Dam Eye study then. I thought, oh, they go through so much, I don't think we can add another thing to that study. So we started, Max and I, this study of carotenoids. And he and another colleague who helped him develop this device worked together with me to develop a standard method that could be repeatedly done reliably in this large population. So I mean, it looks like it was made in a garage, and almost was. There are now these machines at many research universities, and even some optometrists now have them in their office. I should say that the ones in optometrist office aren't always the most accurate, but they might give you an idea if your levels are very high or very low. It's not commonly available clinically, but it is increasingly. So it's simple, it's non-invasive. It involves just looking at a flickering light. And what's happening, it doesn't seem this way, you can't see the colors of the light, but what's happening is simply presents a green light, which macular pigment does not absorb, and a blue light, which it does. And the difference in flicker rates that we can see gives us an idea of how much lutein is in our eye. And kind of the big summary here of our data over the last 10 years is that, first of all, the amount of macular pigment that women had in their eyes varied tenfold. It was hugely different. We thought, maybe it's measurement error. But then we went back to the literature, and indeed people doing biochemical measures of this pigment in autopsy eyes find the same variability. So it's very different from person to person. What makes a difference? Partly it is the lutein we take in, but in our sample, it only explained 3% of the variability. So we've been searching for, well, why do some people seem to absorb lutein more, accumulate it in their eye more? Those who had higher macular pigment consumed healthy fat. This is consistent with research that shows if you make a salad, if you put oil on it, you will absorb more carotenoids, not just lutein. Healthy fats can be added to salads for that same effect, nuts, fish. Also, women who had higher macular pigment had higher fiber diets. Again, I don't know why that is. It could be, we speculate that the antioxidants, other antioxidants in those foods might help lutein not break down as quickly. And we're also now wondering if it has anything to do with the microbiome. That's still a big question. We don't know. But also, we did genetic studies. This was fun, because the women provided blood samples. Those who agreed to allow us to test for gene variants had their samples analyzed, and we found that women who had variants for proteins that help us take lutein into our body, that help carry lutein through the blood and take it into the retina, had higher levels. And these are 20 or more proteins that are involved in these processes. We found now in a later study, I told you I'd give you a brief glimpse of what we're finding. We found that we can increase our macular pigment. So these women were between 53 and 86 years. 15 years later, they're an average of something like 80, 82. And women in this 15 years did increase their macular pigment if they had lower levels at baseline. So if you don't have a lot of macular pigment, you can make more, and you're probably more likely to increase if you make changes to do so. In this study, women who had higher macular pigment were more likely to take this ARED supplement, which contains lutein. And our surprise, ate eggs. And this does gel with the literature showing that eggs are a more bioavailable source of lutein. There are some things we can't do. I have the 2 risk genes for complement factor H, as many people do. We can't control that. Our outside environment. But there's so much we can do to help us see better. Avoiding excess of sunlight, we've talked about. Smoking is a risk factor for most of these eye conditions, so not smoking. And today we are encouraging eating well, being active, and considering the supplements if we need them. But also, I think it's good to remember that food does a lot more than the little nutrients it provides. And so sometimes there are days when we have to eat something different that gives us comfort, or that tasted good when we were a child, or brings things that we value. Now, we pass along our genes, as I do. My grandson will likely have some of these risk genes, but we can also pass along our healthy lifestyles. And our research so far is suggesting that these lifestyles might help lessen the impact of genes which promote these conditions. So while supplements might help, enjoy real food, like Michael Pollan said, move and enjoy the outdoors. Start simple. You'll look at these things, and as I did, and you go, whoa, let's see, I don't eat that many fruits and vegetables. And just saying, oh, I can add an orange to this meal. And after a month of adding something new, it becomes a habit, and doesn't look as hard as it looks at the beginning. And remember to pass it on. Now we're going to have time for questions. Do you want to break, or should we start into that?
So if you talked about supplements having an impact on the slowing of macular degeneration, and I know it would be an enormously difficult thing to study, but is there any evidence at all that the supplements can delay or prevent macular degeneration?
No.
Is there any research underway that would try to tease that out?
No. That's a really good question. You're right, it's hard, because we'd have to study this for a very long time, because I think maybe if we studied it in people with the high-risk genes, for example, that would maybe be more efficient. But what's the motivation for those studies? Who's going to give me money for those studies? Is something I wonder. And it's just an inconvenient truth that it's difficult to get funding for that. And I know that some people who have the high-risk genes for macular degeneration often tell their children and their grandchildren to take these supplements. But I think that we don't know how safe they are over decades. I think it would be much more effective to pass on the advice for healthy diets. And in fact, I should tell you that I'm working with the people who ran these large trials, and we're looking at healthy diet patterns in relation to progression of macular degeneration. So people in these AREDS trials gave us information about their diet at the beginning and then another time in the trial. And again, we're finding, this is advanced preliminary data that's not yet published, but we are finding that even in the trial, regardless of whether they were on the high-dose supplement or not, people who had higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet pattern had slower progression of macular degeneration over about 9 to 10 years.
My husband has heart disease, and we're on, I don't know if you know, Dr. Ornish's very strict, most strict, no added fat or oil eating plan, which basically means we've become vegans. And we eat tons of greens and stuff, and I've long thought fish was very good for us, but that's not allowed, as most nuts, although that has changed slightly in the last couple of years, that we can have very limited amounts. How does your recommendations work with the vegan diets and that sort of thing?
It's very challenging to get all the nutrients you need from a vegan diet, as you probably know. Right. So if he's recommending that, he's probably also recommending that you check with your doctor to make sure you have good blood levels of B vitamins, and that you take supplements containing B12, for example. I think our research is suggesting that you may not absorb fat-soluble nutrients like lutein as much. Whether that can be overcome by eating much lutein, well, it might be. We don't know that. So it might be that you've been eating so many fruits and vegetables that your body needs no more. The one thing we do know is that it appears that there is a limit. We all differ on how high we can get our high lutein to go. But once we achieve a certain level, it doesn't just keep increasing. So it might be that if you've been on that diet for a long time, eating lots of fruits and vegetables and greens, that you're also getting some of that.
You had mentioned earlier that there were some differences, especially in dairy, between the 3 different diets that you talked about. And I've also been confused about hearing mixed messages about whether you should eat whole-fat dairy or low-fat dairy. Can you talk a little bit about what you feel is a good recommendation for dairy?
I'll tell you the different expert opinions on that. I think that it's hard in the U.S., in our environment, to get enough vitamin D and enough calcium for our bones if we don't eat dairy. So the dairy and cheese that in a Mediterranean diet pattern may not be enough, and that's why dairy, you get points for having 2 servings of milk in the U.S. dietary pattern system. Some research indicates that milk has inflammatory potential, so their anti-inflammatory diets often exclude milk and cheese. So I think that it depends on whether you're finding you do well with that. If you have high-fat dairy, that's yogurt, a small amount a day, that's one thing. If we eat a large bowl of ice cream, which has a lot of sugar, and maybe not a lot of other nutrients, that's another thing. So I think that if we want to stretch a little bit and think, what is practical, if we eat high fat, we might want to choose a small amount. The DASH diet program recommends low-fat dairy, like 2% or less. But some fat is good.
So one of your slides says women who have higher macular pigment, consume healthy fats, had high fiber diets, and had gene variants for proteins to help take in lutein. For those of us who are not in this minority with gene variants, how useful is the other information?
So let me understand. You're saying if we don't know the gene variants that we have,
yes,
then how do you use the information?
Well, it looks as if you need all 3 of these things.
Oh.
Healthy fats, high fiber diets, and gene variants to have higher macular pigment.
That I did not make it clear that all of those things contribute. So we think that maybe the maximum that individuals can get to might differ depending on whether they have proteins that help lutein get into the blood and pull it through the blood to the eye and have an intake. And this squares a large body of evidence, not just what we found, might have an easier time of, it may not be as important to get high levels of lutein. But since we don't know, there are no genetic tests that I know that study the variants that we studied, for example. We don't know. The point is, we don't know whether we can accumulate it easily or not. But we know that this explains why we, in part, why we have such variation from person to person in the lutein levels in our eye. So I think because we don't know what gene variants we have, what we can do for ourselves is to increase absorption by eating our greens with a little fat, eating eggs, eating high fruit and vegetable diet, because the fiber seems to be associated with higher macular pigment. And I think that we could hedge our bet by doing that, regardless of our genes.
Yes, I was wondering, you mentioned almost in passing oranges, and I've seen it in other references. I'm curious, when you mention oranges specifically, can that be talk about citrus as a whole, or do we talk more local, just oranges and other citrus might or might not do the same?
Well, I'm going to make a wild guess, because the reason that these investigators who actually found that people who report eating an orange a week, it was, had lower macular degeneration was because they think that it's because of the zeaxanthin. It is the structural cousin to lutein, which is high in oranges and gives it that orange color. Because tangerines and other such citrus have a similar color, my guess is that it would be similar.
So for those of us who have been recommended to take AREDS2, hopefully we're going to be living more than 10 years. How do we figure out if it's safe, or do we just wait until the research comes in, or what are your thoughts on that?
There's a variety of clinical opinions on that. I know some ophthalmologists in this town recommend tight adherence to daily intake of ARED supplements. I know others that say, take it every other day. If you're young, take it every other day. Eat well. So I think that you can talk with your physician about it, and I personally take some supplements that I'm particularly prone to risk for conditions for. Again, I do concern myself with too much, and we keep learning that lesson in nutrition research, which is if some is good, more is better. We take boatloads and find it increases risk for things. So for example, lutein intake, like beta-carotene intake, at high doses, 20 milligrams or more, has been associated with increased risk of cancer. Whether the 12 milligrams in ARED supplements is high enough, we don't know. My guess is it's not too high, because in many, many trials of beta-carotene, lung cancer risk was not increased until you got over 20 milligrams. These are almost identical molecules. So I think my guess, again, would be that the 12 milligrams is probably fine. And then it's a personal decision, yours and your doctor's, whether you want to, if you think you're going to be taking this for 30 years, do you want to take a day off Take a couple days off during the week.
Would you recommend that if you're going to take a supplement like Preservision or something like that, that you only start that once you're diagnosed with early onset macular degeneration? Or should you be taking it years before? Or?
I think you should wait. It is a high dose. Some doctors call it a medicine dose of these antioxidants. And so we don't know whether taking these supplements will prevent macular degeneration. You can, if you want to take supplements, there are some you can get that have much lower levels of lutein if you feel more comfortable taking something. But I think that we don't know what long-term use of high-dose supplements can do for the eye and the whole body.
I just wanted to clarify something you mentioned on the Mediterranean or the Crete study. Did you say they did not take in grains? I know they took greens, but did you make a comment about grains in their diet at all?
I didn't make a comment. All 3 diet patterns recommend whole grains, and they do eat many whole grains. They also eat some refined grains, like in their baklava as such. But yeah, so whole grains are part of all 3 healthy diet patterns. Mm-hmm.
May I ask one other question?
Yes.
In terms of the wine effect, you just noticed it part of the Crete diet. In terms of its effect on, you talked about Alzheimer's. Are you showing similar potential non-negative effects with wine and Alzheimer's as you are with the eye?
I have to say I'm out of my expertise.
Okay.
On that. I have heard people in that line of research say there's no safe level of alcohol consumption, that alcohol kills neurons. And I don't know how much research backs that up, but I would be careful, as I do. I limit myself to a glass a day. I think it's a personal decision, and maybe you can get someone that can speak to the cognitive effects long term.
I have a question on macular degeneration. Is there a difference between dry and wet macular degeneration? If so, what is it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is. Dry macular degeneration is the loss of rods and cones. So you get that same spot in your vision when those areas are affected. Wet is, in addition, the development of blood vessels, which can leak and can also go into your line of vision and cause other disturbances in vision. The treatment, we only have a treatment for wet, and that is eye injections, monthly eye injections. We're looking at other kinds of treatments to slow that progression of unnatural blood vessel growth, but there are no good alternatives right now. And so, yeah, so wet is one that more aggressive medical treatment is done to make sure it doesn't interfere with vision too much. There are people asking, if people are using this for a very long time, how does this affect the underlying problem, the cones that are already lost? And that is a question. We don't know if that kind of treatment is making better or worse the dry form.
It's more a comment maybe than a question. I probably shouldn't say this in Wisconsin, but I stay away from cow dairy, but I do eat some sheep and goat dairy, and I'm just wondering, in Greece, would they use any of that? I don't know how that goes.
Yeah, well, in Athens, it seemed that it was very westernized. You could get fluid milk there, but on the islands, many islands, I often saw houses had a goat. There's a different protein in goat dairy than cow's dairy, and many people find that they react less strongly. There's not a huge amount of scientific evidence, but that is something that we do if we have a kind of inflammatory condition and think it might be due to consumption of dairy. Mm-hmm.
This is a question concerning glaucoma. How effective is the vision field test that they give?
It's very effective, and it's if you've had the test, you might know that they do it over time. So it's not just one test that they rely on. If you've had it, you realize, boy, if you go in and you're tired, you sometimes think you're missing seeing the dots that they have on that test just, for that reason. But they do, it's an extensive test, and they look at changes over time, and now people are looking at different patterns of changes over time. It definitely is what glaucoma specialists rely on, they can really help, they can really understand the degree of loss and then the rate of loss in individuals with that test. So I would say it's a very effective test.
Is there anything else that's better?
Well, we're measuring in our studies, and a glaucoma expert, Yao Lu, at our university, has helped us measure the thickness of the nerve fiber layer that goes from the retina to the brain. And so now it's becoming standard practice to also get what we call for short an OCT, or optical coherence tomography image, to tell us how thick that layer is. And so people who have very thin layers may not already have glaucoma, but might be developing it. Or if you have glaucoma, you can look at the thickness of that layer, see if it's getting progressively thinner and how fast, understand the amount of glaucomatous neurodegeneration is going on.
I know I got here a little late, but you didn't talk about cataracts at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you talked at all about the nutrition connection with cataracts. And
we could do that. We've got time. All right. Cataract is more common in people who eat low fruit and vegetable diet. The pigment we're talking about, lutein, actually is in the front of the lens where the light first hits, and this pigment exclusively accumulates there relative to other carotenoids, just like in the back of the eye. So lutein appears to be important. And in the studies of AREDS, even though macular degeneration was the main outcome, they also looked at an outcome of people needing cataract surgery. And they found that in both studies, the supplements were related to a lower incidence of cataract surgery. And with regard to lutein, in people who didn't get adequate lutein in their diets, those who had lutein in the supplement showed a lower rate of going on to have cataract surgery during the trial. So the lens is a water environment, so probably even that's a fat-soluble vitamin, but otherwise water-soluble nutrients are important. Vitamin C is high in the lens, and so we certainly need to eat enough vitamin C. But too much is not a good thing. For some of us, and particularly if we have high blood sugar, high vitamin C could actually increase cataract risk. We don't have a boatload of evidence about this, but certainly enough to be cautious about not taking mega doses of vitamin C. Another example of where some is good, a lot is not necessarily. And the other thing is, in many studies across the world, people who take multivitamins are less likely to have lens opacities. There are many nutrients that cause us to age, and aging particularly shows in the aging of our lens. So some people take multivitamins to lower the risk of cataract, but really if you look at the studies, that's most effective in countries where poor diets are common, lacking particular nutrients. So I think multivitamins can help make sure that we have a healthy lens, but I think probably not as important in this environment if you're eating a generally healthy diet. And it seems like lutein, making sure to get some greens might be helpful as well.
When you're eating greens, does it make a difference whether they're cooked or you're eating them raw?
Yes, it does. If they're cooked, it releases the plant matrix and they're more easily absorbed. It's true for all carotenoids. Mm-hmm.
Suppose you eat, a healthy diet, but you also eat, a lot of cookies and bakery and things like that. Does that cancel it out? Cancel out the healthy benefits?
To some extent. There have been days when I see a cookie and I think, I've eaten pretty well today. So I think to a certain moderate extent. I think that when we eat high sugar things, it increases our blood sugar. If we have a healthy biome, if we're eating it in the context of a high fruit and vegetable diet, the spike is less, and the spike is less if you take a walk afterwards or do some other kind of physical movement, get on an exercise bike, so it gets into the... So I guess our other healthy diet patterns and our other healthy lifestyles might help mitigate some of that stuff. Yeah.
I take an eye supplement, and with lutein and some of these things, and 15 milligrams of zinc, I think, is in one of the supplements that I was taking. My optometrist said, do not take that with the zinc. He thought it's possibly dangerous. So could you talk about zinc just for a moment?
Sure. Was that 15 or 50?
I thought it was 15, 1.5. I think that's what I had in there.
Yeah, that is the U.S. dietary recommendation. So that's not a lot.
More than that would not be good, he thought.
Yeah, and I think that was a helpful comment that he made because zinc can interfere with copper absorption. So I think, and I thank you for that question because it gives me an opportunity to talk about this delicate balance between nutrients. If we take boatloads of some or one or two, it might unbalance us in other respects. So we don't absorb copper as well if we have high-dose zinc supplements. So in the arid supplements, they add copper along with it. But there are supplements on the market that do not also have copper. So I think that was wise.
I had a follow-up about whether you're talking about supplements or food in your diet. You mentioned that vitamin C is important, but you shouldn't have too much beta-carotene. You shouldn't have too much. Is that just in supplements? Or if I eat a lot of baby carrots throughout the day, is that bad, or too much oranges? So if you could just clarify whether too much is
great
just in terms
question.
of supplements or diet.
Great question. Our bodies are wise. They have evolved over many years. So if we're eating more than we need, it starts slowing down the absorption. And if we're eating it in foods, it's a small amount and our body has a chance to adjust. If we take mega doses, it might cause another nutrient to not be absorbed, or it might override those natural regulatory systems. So I think all the evidence that I've seen suggests that it's not possible to get too much of a nutrient from our diets.
I have a follow-up question to your about cooking your greens. Every morning, my wife and I have a kale smoothie with blueberries and other good things in it, and we just use raw kale. And your comment makes me wonder, well, should we cook that kale before we have our smoothie where it's all blended up.
Blending it does it too. It
That's what I
branches the
thought.
plant matrix. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Good questions.
It's like, I was just going to ask about juicing, because you can get, it seems like you get all the nutrients out of those, and it's just, I love the juice, and you can put carrots and kale and fruit, and yeah.
And do you blend it all together, or do you extract the juice?
I use an omega, so it's centrifugal, so I know the ones that mash it up, like, I think the heat in it kills some of the vitamins, so the spinning ones don't have as much heat or friction to the vegetables and fruits, so
Okay.
the vitamins and minerals are.
Does it separate the juice from the pulp?
Yeah, it spins so fast and mashes, and then the juice comes out, and you have a bunch of the fiber left, but so you don't get the fiber.
Yeah,
You
so
must get some of it, but.
yeah, if I used one of those, I'd get myself a bowl, take out some of that fiber.
Yeah, you can use the fiber in breads or, other soups or other things.
Yeah, so your microbes might not get fed that way, but if you're eating other fiber, it may not matter.
Yeah. The other question, for decades, I've read that green spinach first I would read about, and then it turned out all the greens, which was very disappointing to me when I read it, that they interfere with mineral absorption. So that if you eat a whole bunch of greens, don't try to take calcium or minerals at the same time. Take your mineral supplements or whatever at a different time.
Some greens in some people do interfere with calcium absorption or other minerals. Yeah, again, it is a delicate balance. I think there's some natural variation in the degree to which it is a problem. If you go get a bone mineral density test and you're told that you have low levels, you may want to look at things like that. If you don't, if you have strong bones, then you may not need to worry about it.
It's just kind of interesting and complicated.
It is, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Now, there are often no simple answers. I find after 40 years of research, my list of questions is a lot longer than my list of answers. I don't know. All right. But it's been a long time that we're sitting. Thank you so much for the excellent conversation. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much for your very informative talk. In gratitude, the Retirement Association doesn't give you an honorarium, but it gives you a, whatever this thing is. We decided it was called a portfolio. and it has the Wisconsin Retirement Association emblem on it, so you'll be reminded of us. Please join when you decide to retire, or even earlier. Thank you once again. Thank you for coming. Don't forget to fill out your evaluations.
And I remind you, you should have this slide too. There, you have many good questions, and you can go to these sources for answers. These are the sources that I trust. Consumer Lab is amazing. A lot of the questions about specific supplements they have. And when I read areas in there that relate to areas of science, I know they are right on. They'll call things out when there's not enough evidence or when they're potentially dangerous. Harvard has a great website too. And then, does anybody get the Nutrition Action newsletter in the mail? Yeah, from Centers for Science and Public Interest. Yeah, they're really informative, aren't they? Yeah. And we have a website on our team. We're putting the results of this new study on. We haven't put any new results yet, but we will. We have results of our old study, links so you can actually read the scientific article if you want to. And as we analyze the results from this last study, we'll put them on there as well. And we also have like a couple paragraphs that give you the bottom line.